Hello everyone, my name is Cameron Cowan. This is a special edition of the Cameron Cowan Show, the Constitution edition. Now I am most excited because I want to do this series for a long time, and if you have been watching, this is our 5th or 6th video, and we've gone through the Federalist Papers, the intellectual history of the Constitution, and we've gone through the basic framework. It was a lot to take in. We've been through the amendments and how to amend the Constitution, and now we're kind of out into some more interesting things, including this video, which is about the 3/5 Compromise. Now, slavery was something that even a few of the more progressive Northern Founding Fathers at the time would have liked to have gotten rid of and would have liked to have entered into the new Union without. However, they knew that the Southern colonies were never going to be on board with what many people viewed as, quite simply, an economic necessity. Now, the slavery came up as a point of contention in two different ways. Way number one was in terms of representation in the National Congress. Now, for the northern states who were not primarily slave-owning states, although it occurred, it was not in nearly the numbers as it was in the South. The fear was that the southern states would count the slaves for representation purposes and be able to pack the Congress with congressmen from the southern states, therefore being able to outvote the North at any given moment. So the idea of, okay, we're going to have population-based representation, but we have to count slaves, indentured servants, which were still a thing at the time, and Indians, native peoples, differently. And so in the case of African Americans, they came up with what was eventually called the 3/5 Compromise. And it is called that because in the Constitution, they decided to count, and I went over this when we were talking about representation in Article 1, they decided to count slaves as 3/5 for the purposes of representation, which basically meant every slave counted as 3/5 of a person, and so it was only all the slaves taken together did they all count. So basically, it took 2 and some change slaves to count for one person under representation. Now keep in mind, these people's lives were completely restricted. They couldn't vote. So you basically were representing, nothing. But it was a compromise between the North, who wanted to diminish the representation power of the South, and the South, who wanted to be able to bolster their numbers by using the slaves as ways to increase slaves, free persons, and indentured servants as a way to bolster their own numbers. So that was how the 3/5 Compromise was born. Now, the other part of slavery being right in the Constitution comes from a restriction on the importation of new slaves after the year 1808. The Congress decided that one of the things they could all agree on in terms of slavery was that no new slaves should be brought in after 1808. Now keep in mind, the Atlantic slave trade at this time is still in full swing. It's absolutely massive. It represents billions of dollars in economic potential, and was transporting what at the time was considered property, very valuable property for labor-intensive crops like tobacco, indigo, cotton, sugar, and other agricultural products, both in the United States and throughout European possessions in the Caribbean and Central America. So it was a massive, massive business. And so what they decided was that slavery may be something that they had to put up with in the New Republic, but they were not going to allow the importation of new slaves following 1808, which, as of the Constitutional Convention of its ratification in 1789 and following the beginning of meeting in 1791, basically gave the American-based slave trade a some time, I think it was about 17 years to bring in whatever new slaves that they were going to bring in. Now, obviously, it was not a perfect system, and I'm sure that especially in the early days, there was much dishonesty around that in terms of bringing in new people, whatever, and things like that. But of course, once the Britain outlawed the slave trade in the 1840s, the Atlantic slave trade evaporated fairly quickly, just because it was no longer profitable, and there was nowhere to sell there was few places to sell the property in question. And so you had the Atlantic slave trade tended to go away. You also, by the 1840s, had new industrial processes that made economically the need for massive amounts of labor rather unnecessary. Things like the cotton gin and other machines, power loom, mechanized agriculture reduced the need for that kind of mass labor. So that helped do some of the changes, but the reality of slavery was baked into the Constitution, and we didn't really begin to see an excise of that until after Reconstruction. There was a fascinating article in The Atlantic, and I did a video in regards to the end of Reconstruction, in regards to how we basically had to do what was called the second founding in 1865, or recreating the Republic and creating that Republic finally after 80 or so years without the institution of slavery. And it took the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in order to do that. Now, if you haven't watched the amendments video, I suggest you go do so and find out what those are, or just quickly Google them. I'm not going to go over them here right now. It was difficult because, to some greater or lesser degree, Reconstruction never really ended, in so much as they just kind of quit doing it. And in that way, the excising of the old society, the slave-based, racially segregated society, into some greater or lesser degree, never really went away, and indeed kind of bled over into the rest of American life. I mean, it's right in the founding document. That has kind of been a contentious issue, especially in our modern age of police brutality and this sort of thing. It's difficult to read, for someone, when President Obama was in the White House, to realize that his ancestors, well, not necessarily his ancestors because his father came from Kenya, but his ancestors in this country, the black people in this country, who he is a tremendous symbol of, were in the original republic not allowed to vote, stuck in servitude, and counted as 3/5 of a person just for the sake of representation. And it took amendments to the Constitution and a 750,000 death blood feud in order to change a fundamental part of society that many people agreed was just simply no longer practical from an economic perspective, necessary, or just in any regular law of mankind. And in that way, Reconstruction is interesting because it is, in historical circles, it's very contentious in terms of how the southern states were treated, who was going to govern in the southern states, how that was going to work, how are you going to re-include the southern states, make sure all those slaves are treated as citizens, had equal protection, which spurned these amendments. It took a lot, 14 years to get this all figured out and to make this all really work. And we have been playing with it and adjusting it ever since. I mean, from the end of Reconstruction, it took another 90 years to get an end of segregation and an end of Jim Crow laws, because the Southern states decided, we can't keep them on the plantation, so we'll at least keep them where we don't have to look at them all the time. It made it very, very difficult, and in that way Reconstruction was very incomplete, because it didn't, the grand promises that were embodied in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were not really fulfilled until now, and we're still working to fulfill them. And I guess that's the real legacy of the 3/5 Compromise, is that in this country, in one document, we've had to go from African Americans being as slaves and 3/5 of a person counted only for representation purposes to equal protection under the law, a goal that we're still trying to work for. And it takes government, and to some greatest degree, it's interesting because Reconstruction shows the power of the federal government to provide that common justice that Madison talked about in the Federalist Papers, to provide that chance for citizens to be equally heard and for the preservation of rights and property, which you talked about in Federalist number 10. So it's always something that is in tension and always something that is working. This paragraph is good. The architects of Reconstruction policies from the middle of the war down to 1876 included 3 presidents, Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and Grant, as well as major Republican politicians such as John Bingham, John Trumbull, William Pitt Fesden, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, and many others. After replacing the murdered Lincoln, Johnson became until 1868 the embodiment of rapid, lenient vision of Reconstruction, rooted in states' rights doctrine, white supremacy, and decidedly a non-revolutionary approach to the remaking of the federal union. The slogan most associated with Johnson's vision of Reconstruction, which most white Southerners came to embrace, was, "The Union as it was, the Constitution as it is," which meant a swift re-entry to full statehood in the United States, renunciation of secessionist resolutions, and acceptance of the end of slavery, but no advancement in the civil and political rights of the freedmen. And in some way, that is still where we are, even though progress has been made. That is still, to some degree, the legacy of the 3/5 Compromise, and it's baked right into the beginning of the Constitution. So, if you want to read more about this, I will have the link to the story on Reconstruction of the Atlantic. It is very good. I highly recommend you read about it. If you want to read about the 3/5 Compromise, please see Article 1. And our next video will be about one of the more contentious issues in the Constitution, and that of the Electoral College. So, for questions, please email me, email@CameronCowan.net, mention me on Twitter, @CameronCowan, and Facebook.com/The Cameron Cowan Show. And don't forget to catch The Cameron Cowan Show every Monday and Friday on YouTube, with our weekly podcast every Saturday. We'll talk soon now. Bye-bye.